So for the, this is, I love, for the axon, when the signal gets to the axon hillock, the axon hillock is going to rapidly send the signal down the axon. Yes, this signal moves in one direction. It is an electrical signal that is mediated, controlled by an action potential. For this class, you just have to know that the signal is called an action potential. You will have to be able to summarize it, and we're going to summarize it right now. When you get to physio, it's going to be a lot more intense. So what a cell does is it keeps the ions inside itself different from the ions outside. So inside, the ions are different than the outside. And when it comes time to send an action potential, all the cell has to do is exchange those ions. The two primary ions that are exchanged are sodium and potassium. So when it comes time to send a signal, sodium, potassium are exchanged here. Then it jumps to this point. Sodium, potassium are exchanged here. Sodium, potassium exchange, sodium, potassium exchange, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium, sodium, potassium are constantly exchanged through the axon, extremely rapidly moving an action potential down the axon. It is an electrical signal, a change in electrical currents caused by the exchange of these two ions. Okay. So exchanging the ions is what's causing that action potential to move down the axon. That signal will move through one cell. So here, if we stimulate the neuron at this dendrite in pink, an action potential, a signal will start to slowly move through the dendrite, through the cell body, into the axon terminal. So here, not the axon hillock. Here we're at the axon hillock. Once it reaches there, that means there's going to be a rapid action potential sent through the axon. One direction. When it reaches the very end, the very ends, that is the axon terminal, the very end of the axon. Here's what's happening at the axon terminal. For starters, the action potential moves through. That in green is showing an action potential signal moving through the neuron. It gets to that region, the axon terminal of the neuron, at which point it's going to recruit these vesicles, and these vesicles are going to release their chemical signals into this space. This space is between the axon terminal and the target cell. This cell is the target cell. That neuron is going to pass its signal through it and pass it on to the next cell. Through the neuron, it's an action potential. However, in between neurons, right here, at the synapse, synapses are where the neurons meet their target cell. The signal is not an action potential there. The signal is a neurotransmitter. It is usually a chemical signal between the two cells. And I think we already talked about one neurotransmitter, a very common one, acetylcholine. It is a very common neurotransmitter that allows the neuron to communicate with its next target cell, whatever it may be. It could be a muscle cell. It could be another neuron. It could be a gland, the next cell. On your cards, please. So we're going to start on Q3. This one's making you recall to what we talked about last week. Which division of the nervous system controls your skeletal muscles? It is your somatic division, sometimes called your somatic motor division. What is the signal that runs down the axon, folks? What are you going to call that? That is an action potential. Which cell of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, makes the myelin sheath that protects the axon? That is a Schwann cell. Schwann cell. The peripheral nervous system and central nervous system have different cells that make the myelin. We're going to move on to today's series, the central nervous system. We're going to start our first part of lecture with the brain and the cranial nerves. One aspect that might be a little challenging when we're looking at the brain is the brain, based on development, has a slightly different directional anatomical terms. We talk about superior being above, inferior being below, anterior being in front of, posterior being in front of. But because the brain, how it develops, we start looking like fish during early development, and then our brains change directions. So unfortunately, because of that, we keep the anatomical directions for the brain and the spinal cord. For example, in the brain is cut in this direction. The superior side is also, for the brain, the dorsal side. The inferior, ventral. And you can see it's different for the spinal cord. Posterior is dorsal. Anterior is ventral. And this is based on how the spinal cord and brain initially begin development. It bends in humans so we can stand upright. It doesn't bend in most animals. So we still use this terminology, dorsal, ventral, for the central nervous system. Okay. Parts of the brain. The parts of the brain include many parts in the brainstem. The green region is the brainstem. This is where the brain connects to the spinal cord down below. In purple, we have the diencephalon, the central part of the brain. In the back, we have what is called the small brain, the cerebellum. And then the rest of it, the largest parts of the brain, where we do our high order thinking, the cerebrum. You're going to see that these parts are further broken down into smaller parts. And when you read your textbook, there are a ton of functions that these do. I am asking you to only recall the primary functions, not all of them. So in this one, as a heads up, if you read the book, you're going to know a lot more than I'm asking you to. Okay? Just as a heads up. Starting with the brain and how it's protected. We have to recall that the brain it's in the cranial cavity and it is protected by many structures on it that are above it, superficial to the brain. Starting with the most outer layer. What is the most outer layer that protects the brain, folks? The skin. It has to start at the skin. Remember, the skin does a lot of protection from abrasion, from dehydration. It's protecting your brain. Underneath the brain, you have this red and white tissues. That is an organ. What is underneath the skin that's surrounding the brain? What is deep to the skin, folks? Before the skull. That one is the occipital frontalis. We learned about that one today. What is the occipital frontalis? You have skeletal muscles surrounding the brain. But think about it. If you're doing surgery, you have to get through the skin. You're going to have to get through the hypodermis, the fascia, then the skeletal muscles. What's underneath the skeletal muscles? And what is the skull? You're going to have bone. You want to do surgery on your patient's brain, you're going to have to get through the bone. It is shown here. From here up, that is all bone. And then you're going to have this layer underneath the bone before you even get to the brain. That is your meninges. The meninges have a very specific role. They provide a layer of protection to the brain, and they supply the brain with cerebrospinal fluid. So there's a bunch of fluids flowing through here that are going to keep the brain wet. They're going to keep the brain and spinal cord, not just the brain. They're going to protect it. And the cerebrospinal fluid, don't forget, it provides the nutrients, the ions, the gases, the water, the mineral, the waste exchange for the brain and spinal cord. That's what the cerebrospinal fluid does. The meninges is shown here from this part all the way to the bone. That is the layers of the meninges. Meninges. There's cerebrospinal fluid flowing in this region and in this region. CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, that are going to supply the brain with the nutrients, the materials that are carried by the cerebrospinal fluid. There are 3 layers of the meninges that I need you to be familiar with. Okay. We're going to start with the outer layer, the most superficial layer, this one in this light blue and dark blue. That is the most superficial layer of the meninges. That is the dura mater. This is a tough, tough layer. It is made of dense, regular connective tissue. It is almost, in some cases, it's almost as hard as a nail, like your nails. It provides an outer protecting layer of the brain to keep the fluids inside separate from the rest of the body. You do not want to lose cerebrospinal fluid to the body. You do not want blood getting into your cerebrospinal fluid. That's bad news. The dura mater is the most outer layer. These things that are shown in this light blue color they're like fibers. They're like fibers here. These are just fibers. And these fibers are the next layer of the meninges. They are the middle layer of the meninges. And it is called the arachnoid matter. It is called the arachnoid matter because what does arachnid mean? To whoever described that, all those fibers looks like a cavern full of spider webs. Those fibers look like spider webs. But it allows the cerebrospinal fluid to flow in between them. That space where the cerebrospinal fluid is moving through is called the subarachnoid space. That's where the cerebrospinal fluid is just moving through, allowing it to eventually diffuse gas exchange materials with the brain. But it has to do it through this little pink, super thin layer. That pink layer is the 3rd layer. That is the pia mater. The pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater, they make the meninges of the brain. They kind of surround the brain in a sac of cerebrospinal fluid. It helps actually pad the brain. There's fluid around it, so if the brain moves, it helps keep the brain in place. Kind of like jumping onto a waterbed. There's fluid. It's keeping your body in place with different layers that make the waterbed. Different layers of the meninges act like a waterbed for the brain. In addition to padding the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid will do gas exchange, nutrient exchange, ion exchange, waste exchange with the brain. It is kind of interesting that the way that this worked out is that the pia mater is closest to the brain. The arachnoid mater is the middle one. And the dura mater is the outer one. And that spells pad. It pads the brain. I need you to remember the order of the meninges. If you've heard of meningitis, that is a bacterial infection in that fluid. That can be very dangerous, very fast. Because you do not want a bacterial infection around your brain. And that's when it'll swell. And it typically happens in babies because their skulls aren't fully fused. So it'll swell, and that's the swelling of the meninges caused by the infection in the meninges. We're going to learn about the ventricles. You're going to have to be able to identify the ventricles. For a lecture, you have to be able to identify them and tell me what part of the brain do they serve. So what the ventricles are, in this area right there, you can see inside the brain, there's just space full with fluids. It is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. That supplies the internal parts of the brain with cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain can do its normal functions. It needs the nutrients, it needs the water, it needs the ions to stay alive. We're going to start with the largest part. So starting right there, and all of this that I'm outlining, all of this is the largest ventricle. There are two of them. So I've outlined that region right there. There is a right and a left one of these. This is called the lateral ventricle. There's one on the right, one on the left. The lateral ventricle is responsible for supplying cerebrospinal fluid to the cerebrum. You can see here where the lateral ventricle is, how it's supplying the cerebrospinal fluid to the cerebrum, the areas around it. Since the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, the lateral ventricle is the largest ventricle. And there are two of them. Don't forget that. This is the left one, and back here you can see the right one, the one on the other side, behind it. Then you have your next ventricle, this one. And it supplies cerebrospinal fluid to the central part of the brain. This one is the third ventricle. And the third ventricle supplies the cerebrospinal fluid to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We'll get there. That's where the thalamus and hypothalamus is located, centrally in the brain. Our last ventricle, our fourth ventricle, is this one over here. This is the fourth ventricle. This one supplies the cerebrospinal fluid to the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. It is located right there. The only other term that I need you to be familiar with, because we're going to learn it in lab as well, is connecting the third ventricle. It's going to allow the cerebrospinal fluid to move to the fourth ventricle. It moves underneath here. That tube in pink is the cerebral aqueduct. It is a duct that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to move from the third to the fourth ventricle. Okay. These supply cerebrospinal fluid internally to the brain.
Sorry. See the dotted part you have there beneath the third ventricle and underneath the lateral? Is that part of the third or ventricle? The lateral?
That's dotted in black?
Yeah.
That's the other side of the lateral ventricle. There's two sides. Okay, the one I outlined is the left lateral ventricle. The one that's dotted is the right lateral ventricle. There are two of them. That's why there's that 2X next to the lateral ventricle. It is important that we recall the cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow around the brain, the meninges, around the spinal cord, the meninges, and it's going to go inside the ventricles of the brain. That's where all the cerebrospinal fluid is flowing in the central nervous system. We have to recall which cells in the central nervous system make cerebrospinal fluid. These cells, they have cilia. What are those cells called that I'm outlining in blue? Who remembers? The ependymal cells. They sit next to the blood. The blood does not make direct contact with the neurons. The ependymal cells will choose what parts of the blood go into the cerebrospinal fluid. They choose what parts of the cerebrospinal fluid go back into the blood. What goes back into the blood? Waste. What comes out of the blood? Nutrients, water, ions, everything the neurons need to stay alive. The ependymal cells, their job is to make the cerebrospinal fluid. They do exchange with the blood to make the cerebrospinal fluid to keep the brain and spinal cord alive. Cerebrospinal fluid, compared to the blood, has more sugar in it, has more ions in it, more vitamins in it. Blood will not keep your neurons alive. It's not enough. The cerebrospinal fluid is specific to keep your brain and spinal cord alive. In addition to that, we also have to recall that the brain has the blood-brain barrier, and it's created by these cells in yellow. The astrocytes. These cells will come down and they will surround the blood vessels. Surround the blood vessels. They make a barrier around the blood vessels. That whole area in red is a barrier created by those astrocytes. Those cells have special transporters that's going to allow the astrocytes to choose what comes out, what goes into the blood. So the astrocytes also help maintain the cerebrospinal fluid. Ependymal cells make it. Astrocytes maintain it. They maintain it by making the blood-brain barrier. How will I ask you questions on the meninges? The CSF. Question 1. Which cells produce and circulate cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system? Ependymal. The lateral ventricle supplies cerebrospinal fluid to which region of the brain? So be able to tell me which parts they serve. We're going to talk about the different regions of the brain. Okay. Each part of the brain has a center or multiple centers. The centers are the gray matter of the brain. Gray matter is the area of the brain that processes info. They are responsible for controlling some aspect of the body. Look at the medulla. It has 1 center in green, 2 centers in red, 3 centers in blue, the other one in another blue, the yellow one. The medulla oblongata has like 9 centers. The medulla oblongata is like the most inferior portion of the brain. Sometimes it's called the gateway to the brain because right underneath it is the spinal cord. Okay. You have to be able to tell me one of the functions of the medulla oblongata. When you read your textbook, there's 9 centers in it. There's 9 functions. You can read them all if you like, but I'm only going to tell you the ones I'm going to hold you accountable for. I think it even says that in your reading guide. I'm only going to hold you the ones accountable for the ones we discuss in lecture. One of them, you don't have to tell me which specific center because I don't even remember that. One of them, it has your cardiovascular center. What do you think it controls? Heart rate. Blood pressure. These are 2 examples. Cardiovascular center controls the heart rate and blood pressure. That's one of the centers. The other one, this one I know. Don't know why. The yellow one is the second center I want you to know. This one is your respiratory pattern center. What do you think it controls? What about breathing? Breath rate. Those are the 2 centers I want you to be familiar with in the medulla oblongata. The pons. It's the area in blue. The pons has a couple centers, not very many. There's only 1 center I want you to be familiar with. The 1 center I want you to be familiar with, I pointed to the wrong one, is this yellow one. Look at the yellow one. It goes into the medulla and the pons. That means the medulla and the pons are both responsible for your respiratory pattern center. So what does the pons help control? Your breathing rate. Both the pons and the medulla control your breathing rate. I failed to say this earlier. So I'm going to say it now. The pons, the medulla oblongata, and the midbrain in green. These three are the brainstem. So we started at the brainstem. Medulla oblongata is one of them. Pons is the second part. And the midbrain is the next part. The midbrain includes the mesencephalon. So we're going to consider them very similar structures. They're pretty much the same thing. Mesencephalon means the middle of the brain, midbrain. This one has 3 centers I want you to be familiar with. 3 centers. The midbrain is the green region, and the midbrain has 2 structures. Both of those are called the superior colliculi. The superior colliculi are responsible for controlling your visual reflexes. When something jumps out in front of you that was uninspected and scares the crap out of you, that is the superior colliculi reflex. Visual reflex, folks. The inferior colliculi, in pink, there are 2 bodies. This is the inferior colliculi. This one's another reflex. This one's responsible for your hearing reflexes. So when someone screams and yells and it just startles you, those weird noises that startle you, that is controlled by the inferior colliculi. The last one is this red region. This red region, both of those, you don't have to know the name of it, but that one is responsible for fine motor control. That one helps regulate. I should put that word. It's not the only thing responsible. Helps regulate fine motor controls. Okay. So the midbrain does 3 major functions, 3 major centers. There are more, but I'm only holding you responsible for those 3. I'll ask you like this. Here we go. Which parts of the brain control breathing? What are you going to tell me? Pons and medulla oblongata. Not just one or the other, both. One actually speeds up breathing and one decreases breathing rate. You'll have to learn that in physio. You don't have to worry about it here. Which parts of the brain make the brain stem? The medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain. Those are the 3 parts that make the midbrain. Okay. The diencephalon. The diencephalon is this structure shown in purple. This is a very, what's the word? Complex structure. It's made of 3 parts that I want you to be familiar with. Starting with the most central region, this region that I'm outlining in blue, is that region in blue here, okay? This is, oh, wrong. This in blue is your thalamus. The thalamus has a very critical job. And the main thing I want you to remember is this acts like a hub. It is a relay center. So what happens when information comes from the midbrain, it has to go here. The thalamus decides where it's going to go to the cerebrum. That's what I mean by it's a relay center. All of the information that goes to the cerebrum has to enter the thalamus first, and then it'll go to your high order thinking. It acts as a relay center. This part below the thalamus, it's technically below and above the thalamus in pink. This word means below. That is your hypothalamus. This is one of the most fascinating structures. When you read about it, it is dense. One way to summarize what this does is just by saying that. You can take a whole class on the hypothalamus. But two things I want you to remember that it does. Hormone regulation. Hormones maintain your body. Hormones tell your bodies what to do. And unfortunately, because that does happen, it can affect behavior, how people behave in society. The hypothalamus, complex structure.
Is the entropy part as part of the hypothalamus too?
No, that's the pituitary gland, endocrine system. We'll cover that one in the endocrine system. And we will learn that the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work together. Okay. The one that's not shown well, you have a little structure sitting in the back. This is Dr. C's favorite part of the brain. It is the epithalamus. The epithalamus. The epithalamus right here. There's one major gland in there. It is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is responsible for releasing one hormone. What hormone is it? And what does melatonin control? Controls your sleep cycle, your circadian rhythm. Your circadian rhythm is your day-night cycle. And your day and night dictate your sleep cycle. I'm going to stop for a minute because public service announcement. This is controlled by daylight cycle, primarily blue light. When blue light is detected by your eyes, it goes to your brain and stops melatonin production. Makes sense. During the daylight, you want to be awake. When there's light out, stop melatonin production. When the lights go out, very little blue light is put into your eyes. Very little. I mean, minimal. Almost zero. And your body releases melatonin to tell your body to go to sleep. How are we screwing with it right now? Lights, computers, tablets, phones. It's actually a big problem right now that people do not put their cell phones down when they go to bed. It messes with your sleep cycle. Okay. Many of your phones now have nighttime mode. Nighttime mode cuts the blue light, so it doesn't affect your melatonin release. It'll only send blue, red, and green light. So it looks a little funky, but it'll help you get better sleep, believe it or not. That is true of modern TVs, modern monitors, modern tablets, modern phones. Okay. Can help you with your house lights. That'll affect you as well. Okay. The worst thing you can do is stay up at night on your cell phone. Worst thing you can do is give your children melatonin. That's a big problem in today's society as well that people aren't willing to admit. Kids are becoming addicted, dependent on melatonin. When they're adults, insomnia. Not fun. The cerebellum literally means the small brain. The cerebellum, you can see its area of gray matter. Gray matter is the centers where it does the processing, the dark part. And you'll be able to see the white part, the white matter. For the cerebellum, I love this term, the white matter of the cerebellum is called the arbor tree vitae, the tree of life. Because without the cerebellum, no life. This red part is responsible for motor coordination. No motor coordination, no breathing. It was nice knowing you. No motor coordination. You can't put right foot in front of left foot. It's the weirdest thing to think about. You don't think about right foot goes in front of left anymore. You did when you were little. Didn't figure it out. Cerebellum will eventually figure it out. The other thing the cerebellum does is it's responsible for this word, proprioception. Your body has to know where parts are at. Your body has to know your arm is here. So you only have to lift it about 3 feet to put something on the top of the shelf. Your body has to have an idea of where your organs, where your muscles are at for proper movement, coordination. That's what the cerebellum does. Motor coordinations. Correct. And it's more than just muscle spindles, but there's a lot of receptors, proprioception, that tell the body how parts are oriented. Like when you fall asleep like this, you wake up, your body knows your arm, your forearm is above your head. Your body knows that, right? So you can respond to it appropriately. You know how to move it. You don't twist it. Your body knows where your muscles, where your organs are at for appropriate function. The cerebrum has gray matter, and the gray matter are the processing centers. There are a few areas for the cerebrum, it being the largest part, that we must identify. This part in pink and red, this is a lobe of the brain. What's that region in the front called? That's your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe does a lot. Critical thinking, planning, how to respond to things, problem solving, voluntary motor frontal lobe. You're going to read about it. It does more. Personality, memory. Does a lot. These are the two primary things I want you to familiarize yourselves with. It's responsible for how you're going to plan your days. What are you going to do? How are you going to overcome obstacles? And the muscles required to do so. Frontal lobe. In blue, side of the head, top side of the head. What's the bone that covers that called? That is your parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe. Primary thing. General senses. Touch, temperature, pain, pressure. General senses are processed by the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is also responsible for other things like math. Math. You're not so good at math. But the parietal lobe to blame. I would have thought so too. In the green, what's the back of the brain called? That is your occipital lobe. This one is responsible for one primary thing. Your vision, your visual cortex is there. People get hit in the back of the head, they're blind for the rest of their lives. Happens a lot to baseball players. Before they used to have, I remember when I went to my first game, they didn't have to wear those hard helmets. Most of them did, but they didn't have to. Side of the head. This is your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe is responsible for two primary senses. What is it? Hearing and balance. We say equilibrium. We understand what hearing is. You're hearing me right now. That's the part that's allowing you to hear, to interpret sound. Equilibrium. If you get motion sickness, car sickness, you have that to blame. It's how you perceive the world and whether you're oriented in the correct position. Okay. Temporal lobe. You have two association areas. The one in purple, gustatory association area. What is gustatory? That is where you interpret taste. And in pink down here, you have your olfactory association area. What is olfactory? That is where you interpret smell. And that's why smells trigger memory more than any other sense. I can pass around cinnamon to everybody right now, and everybody's going to remember something different. It triggers a memory instantly. The white matter. White matter is the track. How information is sent to the brain, through the brain. It is the pathway the signal gets to. Let's talk about the white matter. So you saw something. It went to your occipital lobe. Now you need to think about what you saw. It's going to go through this red track, this red fiber, so it can get here, so you can decide what to do with what you see. You heard something. It has to get up to here, so you can decide what to do about it. These pathways in red are your longitudinal tracks. They connect different lobes to each other. Tracks, fibers, I can't remember which one your book uses. Longitudinal tracks, longitudinal fibers. These ones that connect within the same lobe. Within the same lobe. Those are arcuate tracks. Within the same lobe, they'll communicate. Arcuate tracks. When we look at the front view, connecting the left and the right side of the brain, so it'll connect this part with this part, with this part, with this part. It'll connect the left and the right sides. That is the corpus callosum. It allows the right side of the brain to communicate with the left side of the brain. When the signals get to the thalamus and then they move up, these are called your projection tracks, your projection fibers. These are all pathways that signals take to get to different regions of the cerebrum. These are the only 4 tracks that I want you to familiarize yourselves with. Again, you're going to read, there are a lot more. These are the 4 major ones: longitudinal, arcuate, projection, corpus callosum. They connect the thalamus to the cerebrum. The thalamus is the relay center. That's how the information is sent to the rest of the cerebrum. I'm sorry, folks. You can take a whole class on the limbic system, and we're going to give it 3 minutes of time. The limbic system is incredibly complex, and the limbic system is something. Every single time I read a book, I read an article, we don't know how the hell it works. That's what I get every single time. The limbic system is made of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe. It's made of many parts in those regions, and they work together. This is what they control. They control hormones. They control appetites. They control, like, what's the word? I think it's called, oh God, wakeness. How awake are you? How alert are you? There's one more I wanted to say. Hormones, appetites, wakeness. I don't know what the last one is. This is a very interesting system because this will determine how you act in society. You guys have TikTok. You see how people act like damn fools on it. I will tell you, some of them probably suffer from some issues in their limbic system, and it's probably true. What's really sad is it does. Appetites. This isn't just food. This is drugs, alcohol, sex, weakness, bad attitudes. Some people are tired all the time. That'll affect someone's attitude. Fear, anxiety, depression, personality. This can make someone a sexual predator. And after we find out that they've been dead, we find out this part wasn't working. That person had no empathy. They could not experience empathy. They could not experience sympathy because of how their brain is set up. We do not understand this enough. The amygdala, yes. We do not understand this. It'll affect behavior, personality, just how you function. Okay. CTE. Remember what CTE is. And it'll affect this. It'll affect this, right? And it's seen in a lot of football players because they've experienced a lot of concussions, and it'll affect this. And then later on in life, they suffer from suicide. It's a shame. We do not understand this enough. We do not understand how to repair this enough. It is a shame. What are you going to tell me? What is one major function of the cerebellum? Motor coordination. Perfect. Which parts of the brain control sleep? The pineal gland, the epithalamus. The epithalamus includes the pineal gland. They're kind of the same thing. Yeah. We're keeping the brain that simple, folks. Just knowing what those parts do. We're not going to talk about how the information travels to one another. That gives me a headache. But we do have to know the cranial nerves. This is going to help you for lab. We have to know all 12 cranial nerves. I expect you to be able to read Roman numerals. And for some reason, doctors still write the cranial nerves as Roman numerals. I do not know why. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You will have to be able to see this on the models for lab. For lecture, I expect you to be able to name them, number, what they do. We're just going to go through each one. Cranial nerve number 1 is your olfactory nerve. This is your olfactory bulb. Your olfactory nerves go right through that cribriform plate in the ethmoid. So your nerves get into your nasal cavity. So when somebody puts odors in the air, someone rips a fart, that means fart particles have gotten into your nose. Lovely. And they attach to these nerves. Olfactory is the nerve that is responsible for smell. This nerve is designed to be sensory only. It only sends sensory information. Cranial nerve number 1, olfactory. Sense of smell, sensory only. Cranial nerve number 2, optic. Light goes in, vision. Look at the information's gonna travel to your occipital lobe so it can be processed. That's how the light information gets to the back of your head so you can see. The optic nerve is only this one on both sides, just that track. It's responsible for vision. This one, sensory only. The first three I'll start with O. Olfactory, number 1. Optic, number 2. Ocular motor, cranial nerve number 3. Cranial nerve number 4, trochlear. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens. All 3 of these nerves are responsible for eye movement. Your brain coordinates eye movements using 3 nerves. When you roll your eyes at your professors, you use all 3 nerves. When you close your eyelids, you're using the ocular motor nerve. But these are for eyes and eyelid movements. All 3 of these are motor only. They control all of those eye muscles you see there. Cranial nerve number 5. This one's a beast. Trigeminal. This one's called trigeminal because it starts here and it branches into 3 major nerves. One of them goes to the forehead. One of them goes to your face around your nose. The other one goes to your chin. Trigeminal is responsible for facial sensory, touch, pressure, temperature, pain. All along the front of your face. This is sensory. It also controls your jaw muscles, opening and closing your jaws. Motor. Folks, this one is both sensory and motor. Cranial nerve number 7. 6 was abducens, eye movement. Cranial nerve number 7 is your facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 7 comes out to control all of your facial muscles. This one is responsible for facial motor, aka expressions, smiling, frowning, etc. It also does something else that is weird to think about, but it is responsible for taste. Facial nerve is both motor and sensory. It's both. It's weird though. Trigeminal is facial sensory. Facial expressions. Two different nerves controlling two different things in the face. Look at the spelling on this one. Cranial nerve number 8. Vestibulocochlear nerve. Your vestibulo part is equilibrium. Your cochlear is hearing. Your vestibulocochlear nerve is the nerve that comes off of your ear, and your ear is responsible for sensory of hearing, sensory of equilibrium. The vestibulocochlear nerve is sensory only. Cranial nerve number 9. Glossopharyngeal. Glosso means tongue. The pharynx is like the throat area. Glossopharyngeal. The throat area. This is the nerve that is used to swallow foods and drink. Motor. The glossal part. Taste. The glossopharyngeal nerve is both motor and sensory. There's technically a third, but we won't talk about it. But yes, your tongue is the next one. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. This nerve is responsible for visceral control. It controls your visceral organs, heart rate, breathing rate, digestion rate. Visceral organs. It's motor. It is also responsible for visceral sensory. Touch, temperature, pain of your viscera. This one is both motor and sensory. I always tell students, remember, with V for vagus is for visceral motor, visceral sensory. And look at how Vegas is spelled. It's not spelled Viva Las Vegas. My computer always tries to autocorrect it. I don't know what my computer's trying to tell me, but it always will autocorrect it. It's telling me to let's go. Accessory cranial nerve number 11. The accessory nerve is responsible for the muscles in the back of the neck. The accessory nerve is motor only. This is the muscles that when they contract, they allow you to look up. Hypoglossal. This means below the tongue. This one is motor only. This one controls tongue movements used for speech, eating, etc. That's all 12 cranial nerves. Like if it's only a little bit, right? Cranial nerve numbers. Olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlea, stupid mnemonic. Goes through my head every time. Oh, because it feels good. Oh, to touch and feel. Very grainy, velvet, and hemp. Velvet and hemp are fabrics that feel weird. You have to remember the first three. Olfactory, optic, ocular motor. Trochlea, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. So it'll at least help you determine what letter cranial nerve number 4 starts with, right? So you can recall that nerve. You do have to tell me what they do. And it helps to remember if it's sensory, motor, or both. I will ask you, is it sensory, motor, or both? And there's another silly mnemonic. Sensory, motor, both, motor, both, sensory, both, motor. Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter more. So remember the nerve type. If you remember olfactory, sensory only, it should help you recall, okay, it's sensory. To recall what sensory? Smell. Optic and ocular motor, students get mixed up all the time. But if you remember, one is sensory, optic is sensory, vision. Ocular motor is motor, eye movement. So I can ask you, name, number, sensory, motor, both. What does it do? I can ask you this. Folks, this is why I make you learn this, because you're going to experience, after being in a car accident, your patient is suffering from difficulty of swallowing. Could you imagine that? We don't think about it, but could you imagine being thirsty as all hell and not knowing, not being able to swallow because that nerve is damaged? That's a scary feeling. Which nerve controls swallowing? Glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 9. Like in this picture, I have the cursor on the bad area. A man's left eye is always drooped. What cranial nerve might be affected? Oculomotor. That's the one that controls the eyelid. Because only one side of the ocular motor was damaged. What happens during a stroke? The face droops. So which nerve is that? It's not ocular motor. It is facial. During a stroke, one side of the brain is affected. So only one side of the facial nerve, that's why it's usually the left or the right side will be droopy. Usually not both. It can be both though. There's not enough blood flow going to the nerves. They don't get enough exchange with the cerebrospinal fluid. The nerve dies. They can't control it anymore. That's why I'm asking you to know this, folks. Makes sense, right? Look at this one. On your cards. Answer. Okay, your patient always complains of a disagreeable odor, even though it doesn't exist. What cranial nerve might be affected, folks? Olfactory. This happens where somebody's like, it smells like gas. And it doesn't smell like anything. To them, it will smell like gas for the rest of their lives. Your patient experiences dizziness. That means to them, they feel like the broom is spinning even when they're standing still. What cranial nerve might be affected? Vestibulocochlear. What is that called? Vertigo. Vertigo is not a fun thing to have. You wake up and it's like you're just spinning and spinning. You can't even stand up straight. When you're drunk, other things happen. Right? Could you imagine experiencing that without the drink? Not so fun. That's vertigo. All right, this is what we're going to take. I'm going to record this so that it's picked up. Okay. So, a few things. Number one, next week we do the peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system on October 9th. October 16th, lecture exam number 2. That's week 9. At week 9, more than half the class is over. It is flying. Okay. Your lecture quiz is due Friday. Friday, I'm probably going to open up another one. I've been trying to open up on Thursday, but it's not happening. Why? I teach 12 hours on Wednesday, 10 hours on Thursday. It's not going to happen until Friday. Yeah, it just doesn't happen fast enough. Okay, so it will be due Fridays. It will open up Fridays, be due Friday. So this Friday, you're gonna get another one that's due the following Friday. Yeah. But there's one that's due this Friday that I opened up last Friday. So make sure you're keeping up with those online quizzes. This week will include a lab quiz as well. Okay, because 2 weeks after our lecture exam, we have a lab exam. I need you guys to stick on it. Stay on it. 2 weeks after our lecture, oh wait, I'll tell you right now. It's 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So it's flying. The spinal cord. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. The central nervous system is responsible for processing info. We talked about many parts of the brain that process info. The spinal cord has a lot of white matter. White matter is the motor pathways, how the motor functions go down. White matter is how the sensory pathways go up to the brain. So you have your afferent sensory and your efferent motor that travel through the spinal cord. That's the white matter. The gray matter of the spinal cord does processing. Processing. Let's talk about this. All right. So here you have some sort of sensory receptor. Touch, temperature, pain, pressure, vibrations, chemicals. It's going to send an action potential through a sensory neuron. That is sensory. Afferent. The spinal cord is going to interpret that information, the gray matter, and it's going to decide how it travels up the spinal cord and eventually how it gets to the brain. That is more sensory pathway afferent. Information arriving to the brain. The motor information will then travel down the brain, down the spinal cord to the gray matter of the spinal cord. That is motor. How are you going to respond to what you just touched? Efferent pathway traveling through the spinal cord. Then the spinal cord is going to decide how it goes out to the body. How is your body going to have a motor response? Oh, a motor response to what you just detected. That is an efferent pathway, okay? So the spinal cord is technically responsible for pretty much this region. Where is that information going to go? And how is it going to travel there? The spinal cord lives inside your vertebral column. Inside your vertebral column. Each vertebrae has one nerve sticking out of it. Here is one nerve sticking out of it. Here's another one, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one, another one. So you have cervical 1, C1, spinal nerve. That's a spinal nerve. You have C2, C3. How many spinal nerves are cervical, folks? Ah, that's a trick question. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves. Why? Because the very first one has one coming off the top and one coming off the bottom. So there's an extra one for cervical. Cervical is the only one that has an extra spinal nerve. The rest of them match the vertebral number T1, T2, all the way down to T12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Lumbar vertebrae, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, L1 to L5. And then you have sacral, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, S1 to S5. And some people, not everybody, has 1, 2, coxal 1, coxal 2. When you cut the spinal cord, when you get a cross section of it, here's what it looks like. This is what a cervical spinal cord looks like. This is what a thoracic, lumbar, sacral, they look different because of what they're doing, what information they're sending. But what you can see is the gray matter. I am outlining the gray matter of the spinal cord. It is the dark regions. That gray matter is what processes the information that is sent to and away from the spinal cord. The white matter is everything else. That is all the white matter. The white matter is how information will either travel up to the brain or travel down through the spinal cord. So the white matter is sending information up or down. And the gray matter is what's processing information that is traveling through the spinal cord. You can see the cervical vertebrae. The gray matter looks different than the thoracic. I love the thoracics because it looks like the Honda symbol. That's the gray matter. You can see clearly the gray matter in all areas of the spinal cord. The spinal cord sits in the vertebral column. It is important for you to understand how the spinal cord is arranged. You must recall that information travels up the spinal cord, sensory, or down the spinal cord, motor. That is essential for you to understand, because you will be dealing with patients who are going to get in a car wreck and their spinal cord is severed at T5. You must be able to tell me what the consequences of this are. What type of paralysis? Well, I told you it's at T5. That is a paraplegic. Why? The information cannot go lower than this. The information that is coming up from the foot, from the legs, does not travel up the spinal cord anymore because it is severed right there. All the information going down and up does not exist anymore.
I wonder if it's like, if it happens anywhere like above the hip line in the thoracic part, does that mean you like bladder and like visceral sensory stuff too?
Exactly.
So they have no control of the.
Nope. They will have no control over certain bowel movements, urinary functions, reproductive functions, depending on where the sever occurred. Their intestines will still work, but they won't have control over it. Those pee bags, colostomy bags, to collect that stuff. Colostomy bags a little different, but yeah, they will have stuff to collect what their body expels. All right. The spinal cord sits in the vertebral canal. I almost forgot what it was called. The vertebral canal. The spinal cord, just like the brain, is protected by the 3 layers of the meninges. Here they are. So all of that represents the meninges. What does the meninges do? It keeps the cerebral spinal fluid flowing around the spinal cord. This blue space, cerebrospinal fluid, is flowing around the spinal cord. The most outer layer is the tough layer. That's the dura mater. The middle layer, that's where there's a lot of cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid matter. And the really thin layer, the pia matter. That means that this region is where the spinal cord is. So the outer layers, the meninges, protects the spinal cord, as do the vertebra. We have the gray matter and the white matter. You must be able to tell me which side is posterior or anterior. Well, we have the vertebra here, so it's helpful. This is the spine of the vertebra. Does that point anterior or posterior? Okay. However, for the spinal cord, we don't use that word. What word do we use? Dorsal. That means this side, and the way you're going to tell is this fissure. This is a fissure. On the anterior side, there is the fissure. We don't say anterior, we say ventral. I forgot the T there. That fissure is literally called the ventral median fissure. That's going to be your landmark to determine what is ventral versus dorsal. On the dorsal side, it just has a line that is called the dorsal median. It is not a fissure. It is called a sulcus. So you have to be able to use those 2 points of reference to determine what is dorsal, what is ventral. For example, in this image, which side, A or B, which one is dorsal? What is this? That is your ventral median fissure. That is the ventral side. B is the dorsal side. That is your giveaway right there, folks. Ventral. Because for the gray matter, you have to identify the 3 different regions. 1, 2, 3. The 3 different regions of the gray matter. Number 1 is on the dorsal side. That is called the dorsal horn. Number 3 is on the ventral side. What is that called? The ventral horn. Who wants to take a crack at it? What is number 2 called? Lateral horn. Those are the 3 distinct regions of the gray matter. You'll be able to see it here too. 1, 2, 3. The white matter also has regions. There's 1, 2, and 3. These are not called horns. Region number 1. Is that dorsal or ventral? That is your dorsal funiculus or your dorsal column. I don't care which you call it. Has 2 names. Dorsal funiculus, dorsal column. What is region 3 in blue there in pink? Ventral column, ventral funiculus. Doesn't matter to me. You can use either. And this region? Lateral column, lateral funiculus. Again, you can use either funiculus or column for the white matter.
I got a quick question. So on the practicum study guide, it says anterior, lateral, and posterior.
So you can use whichever one. Okay. But for the lab practicum, stick with column to make your life easier.
Well, I'm talking about it says like anterior and posterior.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. That needs to be updated. But you can use those. Does that make sense? You can use those. We should be looking out for that. I should accept posterior column, dorsal column. Okay, we will accept those. The gray matter. Remind me, which one was this one? The dorsal horn. Folks, the dorsal horn is the area on the spinal cord that processes sensory information. Do you see this arrow going in? That means sensory info goes into that region. This area in red, which one is that one called? The ventral horn. The ventral horn is very specific. This one is somatic motor. What does somatic motor mean? Skeletal muscles, things you control, things you consciously think about. Because the lateral horn, that one is motor as well. This one is visceral motor. Visceral motor means things you do not consciously think about. Involuntary motor responses. Digestion, sweating, urinating, blood pressure, controlling those motor responses. When the neuron leaves that, it goes down this way. That's why there's that arrow. When the neuron leaves, it goes down this way. That's why there's that outer arrow. Because this is efferent motor. That makes this one afferent. This part right here is called the dorsal root. It is rooted to the spinal cord. It's like a root coming off of the spinal cord. This one in the front, all the way, is the ventral root. And then there's this like bulge This is your dorsal root ganglia. The ganglion is a bulge. There's a lot of cell bodies in there. So the dorsal root is associated with the dorsal horn. The ventral root is associated with the dorsal horn and the lateral horn. So when it comes time to getting a motor response, this is where the neuron of a motor neuron begins, at the spinal cord. So you do have a motor neuron that comes from the brain. And then the next neuron begins right here, if it's going to your skeletal muscles. That neuron is going to leave into the ventral root. It's going to enter this region. This is where the ventral root and the dorsal root ganglia become one. This is a spinal nerve. From the spinal nerve, you have your dorsal ramus. That literally means dorsal branch. And your let me pick a different color. And your ventral ramus, your ventral branch. So this motor neuron, if it's going to go to the back side of the body, like your back muscles, it's going to travel out of the dorsal ramus. If it goes to your front muscles, like your like your abs, technically, your limbs are considered the ventral side. So your arms and legs, it's going to go that direction. When it comes time for the sensory, someone pokes your back. It starts at the back. That information is going to go into the dorsal ramus, to the spinal cord, to the dorsal root, into the dorsal horn. So the direction of these is important to understand. We're going to go through one by one so we know how it travels through the spinal cord. How does that spinal cord send the information out? How does the spinal cord send the information up? So this one is an example, a motor neuron that goes to your arm. That starts right here in the ventral horn. This one's specific. The neuron is going to come out the ventral root. That neuron is going to go into the spinal nerve. To get to the arm, it's going to come out the ventral ramus. And eventually, it'll get to a muscle in the arm. That's how it's going to recruit the muscle in the arm. Has to start at the ventral horn, ventral ramus, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, to get to the front of the body. That is its pathway, folks. To get to the back of the body. Motor neuron to the back. It starts right here. What is that region called? The ventral horn. It leaves the spinal cord out of this region. What is that region called? The ventral root. It's going to enter this region. What is that region called? The spinal nerve. It's going to go to the back. It's going to leave the dorsal ramus to get to your back muscle. We learned those muscles, right? Biceps brachii, latissimus dorsi. Those are two different pathways of motor neurons, either going to the front of the body or the back of the body. Now we're going to do sensory. Okay, you have a sensory neuron in your upper limb. That means somebody pokes your biceps brachii. Weird thing to do. But if somebody pokes you right here, that's where the signal starts. At the receptor. Starts right here. At the receptor. Guess what? This one's going to go into that region. What region does it go into first? The ventral ramus. Then it's going to go into what next? The spinal nerve. Then where does it go? It goes into the dorsal root ganglia first. Then the dorsal root. Remember, the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglia are sensory pathways only, because you can even see the arrow. The sensory information has to go to the dorsal horn. That's how it arrives to the spinal cord. Once it arrives there, another neuron is going to send it up to the brain, traveling the columns. Sensory neuron from the back. Someone pokes your back, they're trying to get your attention. So you have a sensory receptor on your lats. That's what people call the latissimus dorsi. You have a receptor there. That's going to go into which, what's that? The dorsal ramus. What region is that? It's going to go into the spinal nerve. Then where does it go next? The dorsal root ganglion. Then it's going to go into, which one's that one there? Just the dorsal root. And it's going to end up in the dorsal horn. Once that information is there, another neuron is going to send it up. And it can travel in multiple columns, depending on where that receptor is at. We're not going to get into that level of detail for this class. That's a bit much. Okay, we're not going to get into that level. Just know that it goes up the columns to the brain so your body can interpret That's sensory. Somatic motor. What is somatic motor? Skeletal muscles. Where is that recruited? In the ventral horn. That is where somatic motor is recruited. What if I were to ask you, where is visceral motor recruited? In the lateral horn. Visceral motor neuron starts there at the spinal cord, not at the brain. The brain's somewhere else, okay? We're talking at the spinal cord. What about sensory? Where is that recruited? Recruited at the receptor in the body. So depending on, it can go this way or this way, depending on if it's in the front or the back. It starts here. It ends here. So this is the end. So it's not recruited there. It's recruited over here at the sensory. Okay. Regions of the white matter. I need you to understand that the white matter is going to get information from sensory and it's going to send it up to the brain. That's what's happening at the white matter. It'll send it to the brain. The brain will send motor information down to get recruited at the spinal cord. So the white matter is a two-lane highway. Information can go down, motor, or up to the brain, sensory. That's what the white matter is doing. It's just moving the information up and down the brain. And it gets quite complicated. These regions, these color-coded regions, do different parts. One does the leg, one does the thorax, one does the arms, one does the abdomen. We do not need to know it at that level, thank God. Just know that it is quite complicated in how it sends the information up and down. That's enough for this class. But know the role of the white matter of the spinal cord, please. Why is the spinal cord? Why is the spinal nerve? Why is it considered an organ? What are you going to tell me? It's made of what? Write that down. Don't forget that. That's the answer to question 10. It's made of 2 or more tissues. Just from this alone, right here, that is nervous tissue. What do we have right here? Blood connective tissue. Simple squamous epithelial tissue. Just those, that's enough. There's still more tissues. Okay. There are more tissues. This is true for spinal cord and spinal nerve. For the spinal nerves, remember, the spinal nerves are here. What comes out of the spinal cord. Before I move on, this is a fascicle. This one, for example, might be afferent. What does that mean? It's sending sensory information to the spinal cord. This fascicle might be efferent. What does that mean? It's sending motor information out the spinal cord. This is how nerves can be sensory and motor. The bundles are sending different information. Okay. It's important to recall that the fascicle is made of nervous tissue. The fascicle, the wrapper of the fascicle, is called the perineurium. Neurium for nerve. Remember perimysium, endomysium, perineurium for nerve. This is the wrapper around the fascicle. This is made of dense, regular connective tissue. Surrounding the neuron, you also have another wrapper. This one is called the endoneurium. And we're going to summarize this as made of a special connective tissue. We didn't need to know it. Surrounding the entire nerve, all of it, the nerve wrapper. Is the epineurium. This one is made of dense, irregular connective tissue. So technically we have one tissue, two tissues. Where's the other one? Where's the other one? Three tissues, four tissues. Oh, special. Don't forget the ones in the blood. That is why this is an organ. Many tissues coming together. The spinal cord is considered the central nervous system because it does a lot of processing. This is the prime example of processing. Reflex arcs. Let's keep saying arches. Reflex arcs. When the medical provider hits you with the reflex hammer, they are aiming to hit your patellar ligament. If they do a good job and they hit the patellar ligament, it's going to cause your quadriceps to stretch. It stretches your muscles. Too much stretch is a bad thing. Your muscles do not want to be stretched. So your muscles have stretch receptors. When the doctor hits your patellar ligament, it's going to cause your quadriceps to stretch. It will activate your stretch receptors. It's going to send a sensory information that bypasses stuff. It doesn't go through a normal pathway. it's instantaneously gonna recruit muscle. It's gonna send a motor signal to tell the muscles of your quads to contract. That way, they don't stretch. When the quads contract, what do? Kick your doctor. This is why it feels weird. By hitting the patellar ligament, you activate a reflex arc. This is it. No brain required. That's why when you kick, when the reflex, it feels weird. You're like, I didn't tell my legs to kick. This is being controlled automatically by the spinal cord. This is why your doctors check your reflexes. They aren't checking if your muscles work. They're checking to make sure your spinal cord, your nerves are working appropriately. The reason they do the knee, number one, is because it's the one that's furthest away from the spinal cord. If there's problems with that one, they're going to check your hip reflex, your shoulder reflex, your arm reflex, your wrist reflex, your foot reflex, your ankle reflexes. There's a lot of reflexes that your spinal cord controls. They all feel weird. Weird. Because it's a reflex arc. No brain is used to recruit it. Here's another arc that is really important. This one is usually associated with some form of pain. When you pierce your skin, when you cut yourself, when you burn yourself, this is quite remarkable how this works. So if you have extreme heat or injury, it's going to send a pain signal to your spinal cord. But it's going to recruit a special neuron. This neuron is going to split. One pathway is to the brain. The second pathway is to recruit a motor neuron. Why? You have just hurt yourself. You've just burned yourself. You need to get away from whatever is causing the pain so you don't further injure yourself. So it's going to recruit a motor neuron so you can withdraw, get away from the pain. Your professor should not be allowed around power tools and electronic devices. Why? I've burned myself so many times on curling irons, hot glue guns, heat guns. And if you ever pay attention to when you do that, it is really weird. I've done it to myself too much, so I know this. Here's a hot curling iron. You touch it. You withdraw. You can almost count. 1, 2, 3. Then it hurts. You don't feel the pain right away. Why do you withdraw? This reflex arc allows you to get away. It happens so fast you don't feel the pain. And then this is delayed because it has to get to your brain. It has to get to your parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe has to send that information to your frontal lobe so you can decide how to feel about it. There's a delay there, folks, because it takes a long time relative to the reflex arc to travel up to the body, up to the brain, for your brain can decide that it hurts. It takes a little bit. So that's why the reflex arc is like, okay. And then you're like, ouch, 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 ouch. It hurts more after time goes by. It's allowing you to prevent from getting hurt more. Without a reflex arch, you would sit there, you burn it, burn it, burn it to the point where now you have a 3rd-degree burn because you did not withdraw fast enough. Your reflex arcs allow you to withdraw fast to try to get away from that pain. Okay, that's how they're designed to save you from further injury. Your spinal cord processes information without the brain. The brain comes into play later.
For the reflex arc of the pelvic ligament kicking, you said it bypasses physical. It still includes the dorsal root.
Correct, but it doesn't like stop there. That's what I mean by bypasses. It doesn't stop there. Most sensory neurons stop at the dorsal horn. It goes right through it to recruit a neuron so you can respond to the stretch.
So, like I've rolled my ankle like plenty of times. And is it just because the adrenaline, like I wouldn't feel it? Or is it
Oh, yes. And that happens when your body goes through enough pain, an immense amount of pain. I think I mentioned this last week. Your body releases hormones, drugs, natural drugs. Dopamine's one of them to help the pain subside. So in other words, you don't feel the pain 100% right away. So you can get away from the danger. You'll feel it the next day, right? You'll feel it the next day, and that's usually what happens, right? But your body has an ability to allow you to hold off on the pain and in some cases even forget the pain. We don't get into that in this class, but it's remarkable that it can do that. And I mentioned it last time. It helps people forget pains, so people are more likely to have a second child, right? I can't describe a pain that I will ever experience like that, right? And people do it multiple times. Good for them. Good for them. We're going to stop at this slide.